Hey everybody, I want to welcome you to our landlord workshop on assistance animals and emotional support animals, part of our fair housing landlord training. My name's Jason. I'm with the Landlord Launch, and we're here today to talk about all things assistance animals, ESA animals, and really kind of delve in what they are, how they affect us, what we can do about them. So let's go on and jump right in. Okay, so today we're going to be covering we're going to talk about the three categories of assistance animals. We're going to talk about the difference between those categories, which are therapy dogs, service animals, and ESAs. We're going to talk about what we need to know about each of those classifications, and then some of the challenges of working with ESAs, what we can do to protect ourselves, some of the processes we can put in place to make sure that we are not getting ourselves in trouble as we manage that. Okay, so an assistance animal. The actual definition here is an animal that works, provides assistance, or performs a task for the benefit of a person with a disability, or that provides emotional support that alleviates one or more identified effects of a person's disability. So there are three types of animals that are generally talked about when we are discussing assistance animals, and assistance animals is kind of like the parent category of these other subsets, and ESA, the emotional support animals, is one of those subsets. And those three categories are therapy dogs, service animals, and of course, like I just said, emotional support animals. Now, therapy dogs, although they're talked about and classified as an assistance animal, they don't really enjoy the protections of the laws that are in place. So we have two laws that we're primarily dealing with here. We have the American with Disabilities Act, and we have the Federal Fair Housing Act, and then of course all the other potentially more restrictive fair housing acts and ordinances as they go down to the state, the county, and the city level. Now, therapy dogs, think the dogs that you see in the hospitals and the airports and the nursing homes. Generally, what they are there to do is help alleviate anxiety, maybe fear of flying, or just make somebody feel better just by being there. They serve a variety of people. They have no special protections under the ADA or the Fair Housing Act like the service animals and the emotional support animals do. And they're not service dogs, they're not emotional support animals. They are literally private owners oftentimes, either have them trained or they train them, and their job is to go to places where people maybe aren't feeling the best about whatever's happening, and just give them a little comfort and joy by letting them pet, let them interact with the animal, and again, just putting a smile on a face. Now, service animals are a little different. They are highly trained animals, very smart animals. Generally speaking, dogs are the only animals that are classified as service animals, although there are a few exceptions for ponies. But when we're talking about service animals, 99.9% of the time, it's generally a dog. Now, again, they are trained to serve a specific function for a disabled individual that, is seen eye dog, a dog that is able to go grab items, like in the picture here, for their owner. Some dogs that would help with like PTSD, the symptoms, or seizures. You see seizure dogs as well. Something along those lines. Service animals, they're not pets. They can't be considered pets. They are a medical tool that is trained and prescribed to help that person live and work with their disability to live a more normal life. And The thing about service animals that's unique, especially over therapy animals and emotional support animals, one of the things is that they're allowed to go wherever their owners can go. So if an owner can go there, if it's any public place or anywhere that that owner has access to, that animal must be allowed to go in. Restaurants, airports, airlines, trains, grocery stores, banks, federal buildings, whatever it is, that animal is allowed to go with them. Now, if the disability isn't readily apparent, and I would say this is, well, emotional support animals are a little different. I would say with the service animals exclusively, if the visibility isn't readily apparent, there's only really two questions that you can ask. And you got to be careful even asking these. I mean, if the animal has, the service animal vest on, and there's any sign whatsoever, just it doesn't even matter. But this is not only this isn't only just for housing. This is for restaurants. This is for the airlines, for federal buildings, all that stuff. This is in general in terms of the ADA. So if the disability isn't readily apparent, the only two questions that can be asked. One is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? You can't dig into anything else on there, and we'll get into some of the stuff that you can't get into, but it's short, sweet, and simple. And if those questions are answered, then leave well enough alone and move on, especially on the housing side. Do not ask about a person's disability. Do not ask the dog to perform the function. Do not ask for any of that stuff. Now, emotional support animals, a little different than service animals. Emotional support animals refer to dogs and other pets that provide emotional support and comfort to their owners on a daily basis. So this is different than performing a specific task to help a person work through their disability. This is more about relieving conditions, mental health conditions like depression, anxiety. Again, similar to therapy, dogs, that being with them, interacting with them helps relieve and helps them feel better. That's more along the lines of what an emotional support animal does, but the emotional support animal provides more protections, enjoys more protections than what your therapy dogs or therapy animals do. Few things. The ESAs do not require any specific training, any licenses, any certificates, certifications, any of that stuff. They just have to be prescribed. ESAs do not enjoy the same access to public areas as service animals do. So I know that there's a lot of misconception out there that if you have an ESA that they'll be able to go on a plane with you, that they'll be able to travel with you, that they'll be able to go into a restaurant with you, but that is not the case actually. That applies to service animals, but it does not apply to emotional support animals. Obviously with plane and train and different type of travels, perhaps you can purchase the transportation or pay the fees to have them go with you and travel, but it doesn't mean that they get to automatically accompany you at no additional costs and those types of things. And then the one thing that an ESA it has to be prescribed, and it has to be prescribed by, well, this says a licensed mental health professional, but those lines are getting really blurred these days, and I don't even know that that license part is 100% accurate these days. I think some of this is going to depend on kind of where you reside, what type of regulatory environment that you're in for your state and your city, especially like, for example, there's going to be some cities that it doesn't really matter. You can't discriminate against pets anyway. You have to take them no matter what. There are no non-pet housing in some areas. So again, depending on where you're at, some of those laws and ordinances could be more restrictive than other areas. So absolutely know the laws and stuff that you are working with, where you live, where your rental property is located. Now, emotional support animals. There are no restrictions on the type of animal that qualifies as an ESA. They can be anything. I got some pictures here. Some of this stuff seems little outlandish, but obviously it's a thing out there. They do have emotional support snakes. I have heard stories about emotional support gators. Whatever the animal is, the point is that animal is prescribed to help a person emotionally, make them feel better, make them feel calmer, and is prescribed by a practitioner that is familiar with the person's disability, and they feel that this animal helps them deal with that. Now, who can actually prescribe an emotional support animal? So, doctor, medical professional, peer support group, non-medical service agency. Generally speaking, like I said, the licensed requirement is starting to get a little bit gray, but generally speaking, what they're talking about, especially as you kind of read through some of the HUD stuff, is that they are looking for some sort of mental health professional that is working with that person, whether the applicant, tenant, whoever it is, and they are familiar with this person, they're familiar with their disability or their condition that they are living with, and they are able to write a note, a prescribed note, saying that this person needs an emotional support animal to help them work through that condition. So with the advent of kind of like online technology and more medical and therapy and things along those lines going online, that even opens it up to these previously what we considered like scam sites. And there's still scam sites out there, and there's still legitimate ones, and we'll touch on that here in a minute. But with the advent of technology and online counseling and things along those lines, you can't automatically discount those types of things these days either. But the big thing is that criteria is working with and familiar with that person's disability. Theoretically, that's what's said, at least. Now, when you're looking at that documentation, the prescription, the prescribed, it has to come in the form of a letter. And a letter needs to indicate a few things. It needs to indicate, one, that the animal's needed as part of that treatment for that disability, that condition. It should have the provider's name, the contact information. If they're licensed, they should have the license number on there. All of that stuff. Again, I'll show you here in a minute these certificates and these authorization cards and stuff like that. Those, generally speaking, are scams. What we're looking for when we're looking for that documentation to back up that reasonable accommodation request is that ESA letter, as they are kind of just commonly referred to. And this is a good example, a sample one here, and you see it has the elements, due to his disability, such and such, has limitations regarding past trauma, and outlines it just a little bit. Here's the animal they're prescribing as animal is a calm 2-year-old Labrador, license number, issue date, renewal, who it is, date that it's issued, and so on. Here we go. Here are some examples of some of those online certificates, online registration cards and training cards and all that stuff. These, generally speaking, you don't have to accept them. They're gimmicks or scams for the most case. If it is a serious organization that is licensed, they're going to have that ESA letter. They should have that license number on there. You should be able to verify it. There's a lot of this fancy stuff out here with these certificates and stuff, but these are pretty much pay-to-play type deals. You get online, you answer 5 questions, you pay your $199, and they send you a certificate saying this animal is an official ESA animal. Here's the certificate number. That doesn't meet the requirements as are outlined by HUD. Now, having said that, if there are some organizations out there that are ESA organizations, like I think one's called Petable, take those a little more seriously, because if they provide you that ESA letter, as best as I can tell, I haven't seen an actual ESA letter from them personally, but as best as I can tell, they are providing you, the tenant and the applicant and these folks, with actual counseling services. They sign up, they talk to a licensed therapist, physician of some sort or another, make the determination. That person creates the letter, sends it to them. They have a license number. They meet all of those qualifications. That is a little different than the registration cards and the certificates. So again, if you see the letter, take it serious. It doesn't mean that you can't verify the letter. It doesn't mean that you can't make sure it's legitimate. It doesn't mean you can't look up the license number and make sure it's a legitimate organization. But if it is, accept it and move on. Okay, so some of the things that us landlords need to know about ESAs. A request can be made at any time. So a request can come in as they're looking at a home, an apartment, or house. If they are a current resident, a request can be made then. If they have one ESA animal or a regular animal, and then halfway through they want to get a second animal and they do a reasonable accommodation request for emotional support animal, it can come in any time. Now, only the resident, or if they have some sort of person, it says agent here, but caretaker, a person that's responsible legally for taking care of them, only the resident or the agent can make the request. You can't have a brother-in-law come in and say, hey, listen, you need to let this person have a dog because they're dealing with this. That doesn't meet the criteria of making the request. The resident or their agent has to make the request. Now, the other thing is the person making the request must have a disability related to the need for the assistance. So a person cannot request an emotional support animal to take care of at their home because their mother has anxiety and she wants that animal to be around whenever her mother comes to visit. It's not the way it works. The person making the request has to have the disability related need for that assistance animal. And then if the disability or handicap is visible, accommodate and move on. Don't inquire anymore. Don't, if the person's blind and they need an animal to help them, and 10 to 1 already will have one, but that's using a very obvious example. If the disability or handicap is visible, or if they say, hey, listen, I need to get an assistance animal, I'm in a wheelchair and this animal is going to help me retrieve things that I can't reach or whatever. Okay, accommodate and move on. Now, non-visible disabilities, that can affect both the service animal side and the ESA animal categories. So when that happens, you do have the right to ask those questions that we talked about earlier. Is this animal going to meet a need? And then you can ask for that documentation as well on the non-visible stuff. But again, if a person's blind or can't hear or whatever else, if it's obvious, again, don't set yourself up. Just do what you got to do, document what you got to do, move on, let the person have the animal, and get the appropriate agreements in place, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and then move on. It's just not worth it. This is one of the easy things that fair housing investigators can come in and nail you on, because it's on one end it's so cut and dry. Sometimes it's confusing to us, but it's pretty cut and dry from their perspective. And if we don't do the right things, it's easy for them, the investigators, HUD, or whoever else is investigate this, nail us down on this stuff. So again, if it's apparent, do it. There's no point of combating it, because ultimately you're going to end up losing, and it's going to cost you money, and it's going to cost time, and legal headaches and all that stuff. So a tenant can have more than one assistance animal or ESA, but the catch is that you cannot have two animals dedicated to the same disability. So that's where it comes in. So if a person can't have two blind seeing eye dogs, you don't see that. It's the same with the ESA. If the person has depression, that doesn't mean they get 6 cats to help them work through their depression. Now, they can have more than one assistance animal to treat different things. So let's say one is for depression and one is for anxiety, right? Probably a better example is one is for depression and one is for, let's just say, seizures. I mean, to really extreme those out. They can have one animal that is specifically trained to help them work through seizures when the onset comes on, and another animal that's there to help them feel better and help ease their the discomfort or the anxiety or the depression. That is very, very much doable and legal. Each of those animals can also be vetted separately, and we'll kind of touch on the vetting process as we move forward. And by vetting, I just mean checked out, making sure that all their vet records, all that stuff's in place. So now, when we are dealing with emotional support animals, really, or any assistance animals, really what we're talking about doing is making exceptions to our rules and policies. So accommodations are exceptions to rules, basically. Modifications, which we don't really get into, that's something different outside of assistance animals, but reasonable modifications are alterations to like a physical structure that helps that person enjoy that community, that apartment, that home, based on whatever that is that they're working through. So some of those reasonable accommodations, those exceptions to the rules and policies, breed restrictions. I know a lot of us have certain breeds of animals that we do not allow in, vicious breeds, or the theoretical vicious breeds. Some the pit bulls, the chows. Depending on where you're at and what your thoughts are on that. Some of those have vicious breed restrictions. Size and weight rules. So if you have a 25-pound limit and they need a ESA Great Dane, you should be prepared to make an exception to that rule of the weight limit and allow that Great Dane in, although they exceed your 25-pound weight limit. Deposits and fees. We cannot charge pet deposits, and actually I should not say pet deposits. I've been trying to get away from using the word of pet, period. I like to use animal these days. We cannot charge animal deposits. We cannot charge animal fees when it comes to an assistance animal, any category of assistance animal. Well, the emotional support animal and the service animal. Therapy dogs are not covered in this. They are basically highly trained pets that those owners go out and they do good community services with. They're not protected under any of this. So, and then another area is the number of animals allowed. So if you have let's say you have a 2-pet limit. This is a good example. And then halfway through their lease, they need an emotional support animal, which would put them at 3. You have to make an exception to that rule, although they have 3 animals in there. 2 of them are not ESAs. 2 of them are just regular animals, pets, and that is allowable under lease. You have to make an exception to the rule for the 3rd animal. So when we get an ESA request, how do we handle that? What does that look like? First off, this is what is known as, again, a reasonable accommodation request. And RAs, reasonable accommodations, they're not exclusive to service animals, to assistance animals. There's a lot of different things, and that's a whole separate topic, but assistance animal is one of the many different types of reasonable accommodations that a tenant or applicant request. And the first thing we need to do is have a written reasonable accommodation process or policy in place. And when the situation arises, you pull that out and you follow it consistently every time. You're going to want to communicate the process to them. Heck, you can even set up this process or this policy, this written policy, and give that to them as a handout as well, so that they can see that, hey, this is the steps that I take. They were at step 1. These are the things that are going to be required to process this reasonable accommodation request. Another thing we're going to want to do is communicate the time frame that we will make a decision. Make sure it's reasonable. It's not reasonable to say you'll have an answer back in a month. Generally speaking, 48 hours, and you can put a caveat in there, as long as you're able to verify what you need to verify, and as long as they're getting you the stuff that they need to get you to be able to verify that. But communicate that time frame right into your policy as well in your process. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to utilize that reasonable accommodation form. And here is a copy of a standard one that is used by HUD. It's actually like a 2-page accommodation request. But I like the HUD one because if you're using their form and an investigator comes and say, okay, well, listen, here's my form, here's my process, this is the information I gathered, here's my documentation, this is why it was approved, this is why it wasn't approved, whatever the case is, it's right on the format they're used to seeing, so they can see very quickly that you have followed the steps that they have and that they recommend that you follow. Make sure that all your reasonable accommodation requests are in writing, which is why I like to use a form. Because it captures the information that you need to capture to process that. If they just send an email or if they send their own handwritten note, it may not contain everything you need to do. So if they start that way, say, hey, thank you, I received your reasonable accommodation email. Here is a form I need you to fill out so I can start this process. Oh, here's a copy of our policy, our process as well. I hope it helps, and so on. The other thing that the reasonable accommodation reporting form does is it allows you to document, if you have to deny, it allows you to document the information you've gathered, all the things that you looked at to verify the supporting documentation they provided. It allows you to document the reason why you felt that this reasonable accommodation request needed to be denied, because you don't have to approve a reasonable accommodation request. You just have to make sure that it's not protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act or the ADA, and if it's not, and it's not reasonable, then and there are some reasons why it wouldn't be that would be unreasonable. We'll touch on those here in a minute, but it can be denied, but you need to document that very well, because this is one of those hot spots. When people file discrimination complaints, and you have some people that do this professionally, and not everybody. But when you have people that file that, they usually know what they're doing. They know their way around the system. So you need to protect yourself with documentation. And this goes a very, very long way to do that, especially if you have that written policy and this in place. Investigator comes in and you say, okay, here's my logic. Here's what I asked. Here's what they got me. Here's what they didn't get to me. Here's why I denied them. Here's what I suggested to them that we can do in place of this. They didn't like that idea. Any of those types of things. Now, as far as documentations you can ask for that letter from the tenants, the ESA letter. Again, it needs to be by theoretically a licensed mental health provider, somebody working with that person with their disability, that knows their disability and knows them, and can prescribe that legally for them. Next, you can ask for that reasonable accommodation request form to be completed and given to you. Make sure you use that for all reasonable accommodation requests, so don't do it for some and not for others, because then you completely destroy the point of it and you open yourself up for further accusations of discrimination. You can ask for vet records, medical records of that animal. Generally speaking, they say ESA is only on that, and I think that when you start getting to service animals, there's that extra level of protection and privacy what comes with the ADA above and beyond the FHA for that. You can also ask for identification of the animal, like a photo ID, so you know which animal is actually in the home, because I've absolutely seen situations where somebody's been authorized to have a pet. You complete an animal, and you put together an agreement, and maybe it doesn't identify there, and then halfway through the lease they switch it out and like, no, this is the one that moved in with me. Well, you can ask for identification of the animal. You can ask for their breed and their weight and their name and all of their color, all that stuff. You can get a picture. You can do all of that. There's nothing wrong with that, and same with the service animals. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Another thing too, if that animal one of those things that could get that person a little trouble is not taking care of their animal. And if you have, let's just say, a German Shepherd that's going around terrorizing other tenants, to say in an apartment community, then you may be able to identify that animal as that person's service animal. Highly unlikely, especially with the service animals. They're extremely well-trained animals. Emotional support animals, different story a lot of times, but the service animals, again, they're usually really good animals. You don't really see that. I've never seen it, at least. Now, some of the things you cannot ask for on the service dogs especially is the certification or training papers. You can't dig into that. You cannot ask for a tenant's medical records to prove that they have that condition that they're dealing with. Again, you can have that. Again, we're talking medical records. Now, you can't ask for like that ESA letter and that type of stuff. You cannot ask specific questions about the tenant's disability, like, how long have you had this? How does it affect you? Have you ever hurt somebody due to this mental? You can't ask any of that stuff. Like I said, those first two questions that we talked about, and after that, that's it. And again, once again, if that disability is readily apparent, if it's obvious, be done with it. Accommodate, move on. If it's animal based, get your animal agreement, put it in place, and move on. So here's some of the times when you can request, when that request can be denied. One is if they cannot or will not provide that required verification from that licensed therapist, medical provider. If they are trying to bring in one animal and saying they're all emotional support animals because it treats their disability, or if they have 3 ESA letters all saying that they all treat the same disability or the same issue, that doesn't work. One animal per issue. Any animals that are outlawed and banned, and this is the big one. So in a lot of areas of Florida, certain size snakes are banned, and so especially like the larger pythons, the Burmese pythons, retics, and things like that. So if they bring in a reticulated python, for example, that can reach 22 feet and say, this is my emotional support snake, well, if it's outlawed, banned, against the ordinances of that wherever that property is located, you don't have to accept it. That is considered unreasonable and it will not be covered under the Fair Housing Act. If it is a threat to other tenants, or if it continued damage to property, continues to damage property, that is one thing that you can then ask a tenant to move on. Now, it's going to be very difficult to prove that a new resident coming in, that animal is a threat to other tenants if there is nothing that has happened, if there's no documentation. If it's just a pit bull and you think pit bulls are a threat to everybody, but there's nothing that has actually happened, you cannot use that as a reason to deny a reasonable accommodation. I know there's a lot of strong feelings on both sides of the aisle for pit bulls, but if you're one of those people that think pit bulls are just dangerous, no ifs, ands, and buts, and it's on your vicious breed list and so on, it doesn't matter. Just trust me, let it go. It doesn't matter. Move past it. If that animal then proves to be a terror to other tenants, or attacks other animals on a regular basis, and there's a track record of that, it happens a couple times, then yeah, you can ask that tenant to have the animal removed or they have to leave. That's a whole different story. If that animal comes out and continues to damage property, if it's, if you're in an apartment community and if it's urinating in the halls or, tearing things up and they will not control that animal, then you have every right to have that animal leave. If there's noise stuff, so what's the next one? Yeah, letting it run around, waste cleanup, excessive noise. If it's barking throughout the night and they can't keep the animal under control and it's disturbing neighbors' right to quiet enjoyment, you do not have to let that person continue to live there. You can give them notice, and then if they do not correct the issue, then you can ask them to leave, and everything will be perfectly fine. Now, another common one is the idea and the thought that insurance restrictions based on vicious breeds can be a reason to deny. And it actually, to a certain degree, that's true, except that you have to take another step or two here. There's a couple things that you will have to do with that. So it is correct. The animal cannot impose an undue financial burden. So if the insurance company is going to raise the cost or potentially cancel that insurance policy based on the idea that you have to let in, let's just say, we'll keep picking on pit bulls, that you have to put a pit bull in your property, then what you need to do first and foremost is look around to see if there's any comparable plans and so forth that's the same price that allow that coverage for an assistance animal. That's one of the things that you should do to really cover yourself. Next, what you need to do is talk to your insurance company and find out why they do not have an exception for assistance animals. Because if they do not, then a fair housing complaint may be filed against them because they are subject to the fair housing laws. But the thing is, the reason why I say go on and look for those other plans is because if they don't have one, a lot of times they'll draw a line in the sand and say, well, tough, we don't have one, and this is what's going to happen if that animal goes in there, or we're not going to cover this claim. You could still file that complaint. That complaint may be filed, but how long is it going to take before that gets taken care of? In the process, or in the meanwhile, you're either one, without coverage, or two, in violation of their coverage. So you need to have a backup plan. That's why I say you need to reach out and find some other potential plans. You may check with that insurance company too, saying, okay, well, if this plan does it, this is part of a Federal Fair Housing Law Act. You don't have an exception to this plan. What comparable plan do you have that will provide this coverage, since I have to let these people live here? I don't have a choice. Is it easy? Is it quick? No. Is it a pain? Yeah, absolutely. Is it right that insurance company will run you through those hoops? No. But it is what it is, and we need to look out for ourselves first and make sure all our bases are covered, and then worry about sorting out what's right and wrong at a different time. Okay, so overall protection for ESA type related issues. And I say ESA related issues because, to be quite honest with you, the service animals are pretty cut and dry. I mean, somebody walks in with a service animal, you almost always know. And I don't know of anybody out there that has seen a service animal and be like, oh my gosh, this dog is going to be a terror, it's going to tear my place apart. I think people generally understand that service animals are extremely well-trained dogs. And if they can help guide somebody they can't see, or if they can, go to a fridge and grab a bottle of water for their owner, they're pretty darn smart, and they're pretty, there's been a lot of money and time and effort invested in that animal. I don't think people in general are worried about that. I think landlords especially are more worried about ESAs because it can be anything. You can find a raccoon off the street and all of a sudden it's an ESA animal. So having said that, to help kind of guide and protect ourselves from the potential downside of this whole ESA issue that we are working through right now, again, have that written policy and process in place. I personally like the idea of handing it out as a handout, saying this is our process, this is what you can expect, this is what we're going to need. A part of that process, make sure to use your reasonable accommodation request form, use it consistently, make sure everybody fills it out. Because again, that's going to document everything that you need to do and everything that you have done and the logic behind your decision, whether it's approved or denied. Because one thing you could be looking at is if there are two tenants, same exact type of dog, or ESA animal or whatever else, you approve one and not the other, this one absolutely is going to say, well, I'm a single mom and that's why I got denied for this animal when this person didn't. Well, actually, when they come knock on your door, actually, no, it's not. And again, that's not something you have to justify this other person, but if a complaint is filed, no, it's not. They both got the policy, they both got the reasonable accommodation request. This one provided me everything. This person may very well need it, but they wouldn't provide me the ESA letter. I tried to get it from them. They refused to give it to me. I had to deny it. Now, if they provide me an ESA letter, I will do another reasonable accommodation and we'll look at it again, or whatever that situation was. It allows you to justify the decision-making process. And even if you get it wrong, let's just say that you have all of this stuff in place and it ends up being the wrong decision. You make a mistake. A HUD investigator that comes in and sees that you have made a good effort, that you've had this stuff in place, especially as a single-family homeowner. Apartment communities have this stuff down, generally speaking, really well, but a lot of the single-family landlords that own, 1, 2, 5, maybe even 10 houses or less, we're not exposed to that every day. So you have somebody that comes in and takes a look at this, and you're genuine, and you show them you've gone through this stuff, and then maybe you just made a mistake in the way that you interpreted that. It's not going to be near the headache or the pain. It's going to be like, okay, listen, you should have done this. Can we make an adjustment? Yes, I didn't know. Thank you. I'm sorry. I will adjust my policy. Let's get this person taken care of. It'll save you a lot of trouble. Another thing too is, I don't know how many of you are aware of testers. Testers are people that are hired to go out and check to see if there's fair housing violations. Some of them just randomly check with landlords. Some of them are actually sent in after complaints are put in on a landlord and testing different situations. So let's say a single mother was denied an upstairs apartment for some reason. They may send a male that's a single male over to see if they're denied for the same apartment, and if it is, then there's a potential that discrimination occurred based on familial status because the single mother had a kid and the man did not, or sex, or whatever the case may be. There's testers. They go out and check this. Sometimes it's on race. Sometimes it's on the familial status, sometimes on disability, whatever it is. But one of the things that they do is they'll call and they'll ask. They'll say, hey, listen, I got this ESA animal. Do you accept those? Don't talk about the ESA. Don't talk about your process. Don't get into all that. Just keep it really simple, because what they try to do is, when they're testing for this, is they try to catch you up on this stuff to see if there's a potential issue, to see if you know what you're talking about. And one way to get, I don't want to say around it, one way to just kind of clear this up and make sure it's not an issue is real simple. Hey, we're fair housing compliant, ADA compliant. We can discuss this further when you apply, but absolutely, we're fair housing compliant, ADA compliant. Let's go take a look at the property. If it's a good fit for you, I'll walk you through our process. Simple. But don't get into long discussions on it, because again, it's one of those hot topic ones. Another one, by the way, to give you an example, is that they also have testers out there that they'll send testers that will call landlords, testers that have heavy accents, and then they will send other testers in that don't have accents. And if they get different information, they will check in to see if there was discrimination based on national origin or whatever else. So, this stuff does happen. And it's not just with HUD. A lot of these testers are with community based fair housing organizations that are private, that, their whole, either nonprofits, but their whole deal is going out and basically finding areas of discrimination and the social justice type stuff. So just be careful of that. It's very real. I don't have it on me. I actually had a Facebook. This is just about a week before this recording. I saw a Facebook ad, kind of sponsored ad, come across, and they were looking for a fair housing organization somewhere was looking for testers, and they were basically like, we want testers of all sex and colors and religions and familial. They were looking for all kinds of people, because that's what they do. They'll send 2 or 3, 4 different types of people in there, and then they'll have their control subject, the white male with no kids, goes in, and if that person gets a different answer than everybody else, well, discrimination very well may have occurred. They start documenting, and they'll come after you. And those community action groups can actually file complaints with HUD themselves. So just know that stuff is out there. I know that as single family landlords, we don't deal with it as much, but I think that it's getting to be more so, because they know that single family homeowners haven't been exposed, are not as sophisticated. I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm just saying you don't deal with it as much as like property management companies that manage 10 or 15 or 20,000 units. Those guys, they have these processes down because they get hit all the time on this stuff. They know how to do this stuff. Single family homeowners, we don't deal with it very often, so it's not a need. And so they're starting to hit up on us now as well. Animal responsibility agreement, animal leases, animal addendums. Again, I like to stay away from the pet stuff. If that is approved, then use a animal responsibility agreement form, so forth. Again, I like to remove the term pet altogether, because I use this agreement for both assistance animals and animals that are just allowed at the property that are not assistance animals. What this does is it certifies what animals are allowed to occupy the home, and the terms and the conditions and the rules that apply to all the animals. It doesn't matter if they are a pet or if they're an assistance animal. If that dog is running down the hallway, pooping in the hallway, and they're not cleaning it up or not control their animal, it's the same issue. That doesn't matter. The difference here is that what this does is it documents the animal that's supposed to be in the home, what their breed is, their weight, and so forth. The one thing on here is that down here, like in the areas where it talks about refundable animal deposit, that's a 0 for ESAs and assistance animals. We're not charging fees. Same with the monthly animal fees. If you could charge us, we're not charging those for approved animals. But you can use the same form with a regular animal, a regular pet, because then you just plug it in and there you go. That way you're not dealing with 2, 3, 4 different forms for each situation. But again, just one more layer of protection, because then if this animal starts causing problems, well then, now you have the legal documentation to resolve that issue. You're not, just because there's a disability involved and it's fair housing, yes, doesn't mean they get to do whatever they want. Yes, we have to make some exceptions to the rules, okay, fine. But it doesn't mean they get to just let that thing run free, cause damage, terrorize tenants, bark all night. Those things, we don't have to deal with that type of stuff. Okay, so kind of as we're wrapping up here, key takeaways. So just a quick recap of kind of what we've covered today. We got our 3 categories of assistance animals. Of course, our therapy dogs, our service animals, and our emotional support animals. Make sure to have that written policy in place, and as part of that written policy, make sure to use a reasonable accommodation form. Outline the type of verifications that you need, like the ESA letter, any veterinary records that you're going to require, those types of things. Make sure to use the animal addendum, the animal lease, if the animal is approved, whatever the situation is. That way you can make sure that you can enforce the rules for that animal. And I would say, look, this is a frustrating situation. The ESAs, I think it's getting better, but especially when it first came on, it was going on like hot, just like wildfire, and a lot of tenants were out there passing this information between each other, really abusing the situation, saying, oh, you want this dog and he won't let you have it? Oh, well, here you go. This is what you do. It's those types of things, and a lot of people really took this to an abusive level. The kind of good thing about it, though, is that was HUD recognized it. It's actually addressed in some of their verbiage, especially like with some of these scam sites we've talked about and some of these other things. So, I mean, we still have obligations on here, but I know it can be frustrating. I know that as a landlord, we know what kind of damage animals can do. And again, I'm not really concerned about service animals. I'm more concerned about ESA. Service animals, really, I've never actually seen a service animal do any damage like that. But maybe you have, perhaps, and that's fine. I just haven't. But ESAs, I absolutely have. But it's frustrating to be forced to do something that you don't want to do, and even more so when you feel like it is just a blatant scam. You've already denied the pet, and then all of a sudden, 3 weeks later, they come in with the ESA letter or a reasonable accommodation request for the same pet that you just denied. I get it. It's frustrating, but don't be a pain, okay? And I say that for your own sake. Don't try to draw a line in the sand, and because ultimately, a loss, an L in this category can cost you big time. So follow that written policy. Regardless how you feel about it, if you follow the written policy and you're professional and you do the things you need to do, then if it ever turns into a real issue, you have the ability to get that animal and that tenant out of there. If it doesn't matter. And then if there is ever a complaint filed, you are completely backed up. So be professional, follow that process. Don't be a pain. Don't be resistant to it, because all that's going to do is inflame things more. And at the end of the day, you lose that battle one way or the other. And trust me, fair housing claims, they're a nightmare. I mean, they don't, even if you come out of, I mean, I've gone through a lot of them, and I don't think any organization I've been with has ever lost one based on our documentation. I mean, because we just followed our process, and it's actually a pretty clean cut deal. If you just follow step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's not a big deal. It's when you don't, or you let your emotions get in the way or whatever. But even the ones that are just straight up legitimate and we are through, I mean, it's 3, 6, 8 month process. All kinds of record subpoena. I had one investigator. It was a single family home. it was a different fair housing complaint not on that animal, but that person subpoenaed records for a whole bunch of other clients. They went through and called a whole bunch of other tenants, suggested that, asked if they felt they were being discriminated against for any reason, and then suggested at that point in time that there could be a class action lawsuit if enough people were discriminated against. And at the end of the day, we were completely in the right. We had everything in line. This tenant was obviously trying to abuse the system, but it was a painful experience. That was actually our first one that I'm talking about. It was our first one, so it was extremely frustrating. But again, just make sure your stuff is in order. Move away from this and get through it as quickly and as painlessly as possible, because again, you lose one way or the other. So just keep that advice in mind, please. Also, the other thing is, if you are in doubt, consult an attorney. Fair housing lawsuits, if you were actually be penalized, they can be expensive, not only for the attorney costs, but last I heard, there's no cap to punitive damages or whatever else. And would a fair housing claim against an animal go all that way? I don't know. Maybe not, but why risk it? Spend your $100 or $150, $200 now saying, hey, here's my policy, here's my RA, this is what they want, this is the documentation I have, this is the conclusion I've come to. Am I clear? And I say that because I could talk about this now. I could look at this from the federal type of level. I can look at the states that I've managed in, but there are far more restrictive fair housing laws out there than I've personally dealt with in some areas. I've never been in New York. I've never managed in California. I can imagine that theirs are far different than Arizona or Kansas or Texas, even Oklahoma, maybe Memphis. Memphis is pretty restrictive, but in Tennessee. But just make sure to cover yourself whenever possible. Okay, so I have some resources for you. So if you're watching this as part of one of the landlord workshops, and you've jumped on board, and this is kind of like a one-time shot for you, these will be included in the course resources for you. So I have a couple things I found that were, I got a misspelling there, that I thought were very helpful. One's a CIC Emotional Support Animals, the HUD, not HUS, HUD Quick Guide. I also have a reasonable accommodation resource guide that I found very useful. It's from a North Carolina housing agency, but it had a lot of really good information, very clear information too. I've included the fair housing logo and the fair housing poster. If you want to include the logo on any of your forms or the poster for any of your packets, your move-in packets, leasing packets, anything that you want to use it for. If you have an apartment community and you want to post it on a billboard, any of that. So just had that on there. I have a sample copy of a reasonable accommodation request form. There's others out there though. If the HUD one is pretty solid, but if it's too much or too little, go find one that works for you. You can make those as simple or as complicated as you want. Just make sure that it does what you need it to do and it gathers the information you need it to cover you legally. Also have the sample reasonable accommodation policy, the written process. I have a sample one in there. Again, Word doc, download it, change it to meet your needs and put it into place. And then I've also included a sample animal agreement / lease addendum for you to use as part of your leasing packet as well. Okay, so that is what I have for today's training on assistance animals and the ESA process. I hope this has been helpful for you. Here in a moment, we're going to jump off camera and start taking some Q&A on some of this stuff here. Oh, by the way, as well, I forgot to mention on these resources, if you're part of the $11 Landlord program, the Landlord Launch, all of this stuff is in the Forms Vault. So jump in your Forms Vault. It's under the Fair Housing section. There's all this and, of course, a lot more, as you already know. So, yeah, that is what I have for today. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions outside of, we're going to jump into Q&A, but if you're watching this later on as from one of the pre-recorded workshops that we put out there, then feel free to shoot us some questions. I'm more than happy to answer them if I can. Other than that, that's what I have for today. We'll go on and wrap this up. Everybody else, hold on. We'll jump into that Q&A session. For everybody else, thank you once again. This is Jason with the Landlord Launch, and we will see you next time.